I should say that while I had prepared very specific comments, I found today very stimulating. And so I want to sort of use that as a framework and respond to what I heard. I don't know about you, but I'm sort of overwhelmed by what we heard today. So much good work on so many places with so much complexity that one doesn't quite know what to do with it all. And so I guess I'm setting myself the task of doing something with it all, taking, if you will, the privilege of being the last speaker from a more distanced perspective with no real expertise in the area of the world, the areas of the world that were addressed today, to see if I can put it into context. I have to say that the title of my talk really was something of a flippant joke. Elizabeth and I were both traveling in different directions, and she said the thing's going to the printer. I need to give them something. I wrote back very quickly from an airport someplace that I've always been tempted just to say something about memory, and she says sold. That's the title, but then thinking about how I could live up to that title, both as an excuse for being vague and general, but also because the topic that I want to address, actually I need to thank Jeff not only for his kind of generous introduction, but for actually giving me the spur or the clarity that I need what I'm going to address. Jeff poses the interesting question, the important question, why memory? And what is it doing for us, and is it doing what we need it to do for us? And so I do want to try to give an answer to that question. And the answer, I guess, flippantly, is there's something about memory. And so the question then is, what is it about memory that has preoccupied me? Just a little bit about the history of my own engagement, not that my engagement is interesting in particular to anyone, but it reminds us a little bit about where we've come and how quickly we've come. I started working on memory in the mid-1980s as a new graduate student. I know when mid-1980s, I always calculate, when was I born? It's terrible, and the students, and then they say, oh, I wasn't born for another 10 years, and you sort of cringe. When you talk about 1989, your undergraduates weren't born yet. But it was before 1989 that I first became interested in it, and I became interested in it not for anything to do with memory, but because I was interested in an older concept that sort of was in vogue at the time, namely I was interested in narrative, which is a big fancy word, which if you're studying for a PhD, that's what we call storytelling, right? And I was interested in storytelling. In particular, the question that occurred to me in the context of my interest, unrelated, in Germany, was what do you do if you can't tell a good story about who you are, what you've done, and why you've done it? One of the things that we were noticing in the mid-1980s based on ordinary language philosophy, the narrative turn, the introduction of Foucault, and just at the beginning of Bourdieu and Paul Ricoeur and theorists like this, was that groups of all kinds, identities if you will, are formed, maintained, perpetuated, and underwritten by the stories we tell about who we are and why we are that way. And so this question of narrative, whether it was in a disorganized collection of individuals or whether it was in highly organized entities like nation states, or more interestingly, corporations, which were just at the time discovering ad campaigns in the name, where they told their story, or corporations building museums or hiring historians. What is it about telling a story that's so important? And because of my interest in Germany, it seemed to me, at least looking at Germany from a distance, what happens again if you can't tell the good story? Do you have no identity, or do you have to deploy complex narrative mechanisms? And so I went to my advisors at the time and I said, this is what I'm interested in. And it was Juan Lintz, the great political sociologist, said to me, well, how's your French? And I said, bad. And he said, well, it better get better, because you have to go read this guy named Maurice Halbwachs. And so I solicited from the library the one piece of Halbwachs which was available in English at the time, which was a 1980 edition of The Collective Memory, which was a set of essays, posthumous set of essays, originally published in French in 1950, put together by Halbwachs's sister. And it was the only Hallbox available in English, but what this volume of Hallbox did for me was that it gave sociological legitimacy to the topic that I was interested in. Narrative was soft stuff, and really I should be in cultural studies. But here was a protege of Emile Durkheim, the founding father of sociology, saying narrative, in other words, is interesting, but he called it something different. He called it collective memory. It was very shortly thereafter, just in 1992, and I heard about it first in 1990, right around the time, Luke Hoser came to give a talk at Yale at the time, and just mentioned in passing that he was working on a translation of some selections from Hallbox on collective memory. And I was very excited and got into this. But we think that this isn't really all that long ago, that we didn't have this interest in or availability of the term collective memory or memory per se. So that's sort of the question that we raise about the term that has been seminal for so many of the papers, all of the papers really that we heard today, and the purpose of the conference. Where did this term memory come from? Why did it gain the salience it did, when it did, and what work, as Jeff asks rightly, what work does this term do? One of the important things about Hallbox, for me, again, as a sociologist, is that he takes issue and calls into question the common sense lay understanding of memory. Memory, in lay usages, is not only fundamentally individual, but it's quintessentially so. You go to bed at night, you turn off the lights, you pull up the covers and close your eyes, and you might recall the events that happened during your day. Or you might, half in a dreamy reminiscence, look back on other events in your life. Or you might remember prospectively. You might say, all right, I got to remember. It's never a good thing to do while you're trying to go to sleep. What have I got on the schedule for tomorrow? And that paper is due next week, and I promised this and that, and then you don't sleep. But you're doing this by yourself. So what could be, and maybe you are feeling some pain in the process, these are the constituents of the closed individual, what Norbert Elias called homo clausus, the closed individual, which we're told again and again in modernity that we are. American culture does it more and more strenuously than anywhere else in the world. Western culture tells us that we were originally, as human beings, wandering around alone in the forest by ourselves until we metaphorically bump into other human beings and then have to figure out a contract for how we're going to get along, neglecting the fact that we emerge from another human being, connected to them by a cord, dependent upon them for everything. So for me, reading Hallbox was transformative. Not only legitimated my interest in narrative as a sociologist, but reminded me of why I was a sociologist in the first place. Namely, that I believe fundamentally, metaphysically, in our collective origins. That is, that we are constituted as social beings in social contexts with social materials and social purposes. And so one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years, since the so-called memory boom that took place during the 1980s, and which I'm going to argue in a minute didn't actually happen, is that we have come to understand the argument, the sociological argument for the collective nature of what we used to think was a fundamentally individual phenomenon. We were reminded of what sociologists and intellectuals generally in the 1920s and 30s knew well about how collective representations worked and how our individual thoughts were shaped and permeated by these constructs that we called collective representations. Since then, and today, I should have had a little, like an umpire's clicker, and counted up the number of times we heard the word memory, and we heard, more importantly, the term memory studies. Memory studies has become a thing. It hasn't yet got a department. There's no department of memory studies. You cannot get a PhD in memory studies, though I recently found out you can get a master's degree in memory studies at the University of Amsterdam. They have a program in heritage and memory studies, and I'm happy to tell you, just let me click here, that as of last week, there is the Memory Studies Association, which was founded 2 weeks ago in
That's where
Amsterdam.
you went. Oh,
That's where we all were. Jonathan Bach and I are members of
And
the...
Amy.
And Amy, who's left. We were all there, but we were on the advisory board. Jonathan and I are also on, there's a smaller executive board, and we decided it's about time that there be a Memory Studies Association, and so we're in the process of incorporating. We were going to have a little meeting with about 30 people, and 200 showed up. And our projection for the organization is that we expect roughly to have 800 to 1,000 members initially. Where is all this interest coming from? And again, back to Jeff, is it a good and healthy thing? Well, obviously, I think the telegraph ahead to the answer is yes, it is a good and healthy thing, but why? What is it about memory that is so compelling? Think about the new intellectual, the college student or the early graduate student who is trying to figure out how to frame, like I was 30 years ago, an interest in narrative storytelling, or more importantly, pastness. That is one who recognizes that they're interested in the past, but again to Jeff, you referred to the post-factual age and the that memory is too interested in factuality. Actually, one of the slogans of memory studies comes from one of its major figures, Jan Assmann, who says that memory studies is interested not in the factuality of the past, but in the actuality of the past. So imagine this young student who is taking history courses and finding that it's sterile in some way, or that it's not about the ways in which we live in and use and are surrounded by the past, but it's a scientific enterprise, and they think there's more to our pastness. What kinds of frameworks does he or she have available? Well, just last week was at an oral history conference in Jerusalem, and my challenge in this was to address the relationship between oral history, which is a much older institutionalized enterprise, and this new emergent memory studies. What are the similarities and differences? So the first thing I did is I went on Amazon and I bought the oral history reader. Well, there are actually many oral history readers, but the best one, of course, unfortunately was also in 3 editions, and each of the introductions was interesting, so but I have to buy all 3 oral history readers. And then I started looking around, and you know the bar at the bottom where it says, customers who bought this also bought that, right? And there you are. So the oral history reader was suddenly suggesting the public history reader. Like, there goes my retirement savings. So half an hour later, I own not only the oral history reader, the public history reader, the heritage studies reader, the archive studies reader, the preservation studies reader, and I myself am the perpetrator of the collective memory reader. One of the interesting things institutionally that's going on is the proliferation of what we call studies. So another trick you can do on Amazon, if you're having a slow afternoon, and you're a very dull person like myself, is you can go on Amazon and you can click Studies Reader, just to see all the different things that are called studies, which then, when they're institutionalized, get a reader. And you find the Fat Studies Reader, the Disability Studies Reader, the Translation Studies Reader, and the Balkan Studies Reader, and the Baltic Studies Reader, and don't get those two confused, and the Cultural Studies Reader, and the Gender Studies Reader. It's almost enough to think that somebody should study all this, and we should call it Studies, and then they can edit the Studies Reader. But we're looking at this panoply of concepts, some of which are more institutionalized, like oral history research, has its own history. Heritage studies is an established field, has journals. Public history is an enterprise that attracts many practitioners and raises the question of the relationship between theory and practice, between scholarship and activism. And these other versions. how are we to understand this? Well, the first thing that occurred to me is I forgot my Heidegger, and I decided that the problem is with the concept of history and then historiography. And I said it's not historiography because we all know the ambiguity of the term history. It's both things that happened in the past and the study of things that happened about the past. But then if you study it and you write it, you call it historiography. But historiography is also the philosophy or the theory of the writing of the past. So I said we need a broader term and we should call it historiology. Only then to remember after I embarrassingly said this to somebody, and they said, well, don't you read Heidegger? Because of course Heidegger had already used the term historiology in a very particular way. So I want to decolonize or recolonize or something appropriate the term historiology just to talk about the study of all of the different ways in which we recognize our existence in time, and the different ways that we respond to it, deal with it, process it, and in fact, ultimately represent it. Now, so this gets to the question, to something about memory. That this is not an add-on. Temporality is not something we forgot to take into account, and that we remind someone in a dissertation defense, well, when you write this up for the book, you really ought to take time into account. Or sociologists who study a structure at one time and then the structure as it changed at another time, but there's a Grand Canyon in between such that there's T1 and T2, and you have to trace out how you got from one to the other. So tracing isn't as good as comparing as if they're cases. Temporality is of the essence. And this is true both in a scholarly sense, but also in an existential sense. We're all familiar, maybe forgotten, but the famous line from Kafka, which is that the meaning of life is that it ends, or stops, depending on the translation. So, the recognition of our existence in time is not an add-on, is not a distraction. It is the fundamental starting point, it seems to me. And it raises the question of memory, not as a specific concept. The way in which psychologists talk about memory is actually very specific. When psychologists talk about memory, they forget collective representations, or maybe a few, Bill Hurst is in the building, I don't know, adds it on. Bill is a brilliant man, and enjoy discussing this with him, but he's fundamentally, in the last analysis, a psychologist, and argues, as he did in what's that?
Is that a bad thing?
It is. It is.
Oh my.
We all have our domains, but when we're talking about memory,
neuropsychology, something.
right? And it was funny, this bizarre small world experience. After the oral history conference, my friend took me out to dinner in Jerusalem, and we walk into a restaurant. I sit down, I turn around, and the table behind me is Daniel Schachter, the psychologist, chair of the psychology department at Harvard, who also makes this very clear argument about memory. He says what psychologists are talking about, that's real memory, and what all you people in memory studies are talking about, that's metaphor. And metaphors are nice for literary type people. Okay. And psychologists study real memory, by which they mean recall. And they mean recall of specific things, like phone numbers, social security numbers, lists of nonsense syllables, random words, facts about the past, whether we can call up more facts if we're three of us in a group, or each of us sitting in a cubicle by ourselves. Very interesting processes, very worthy of studying. But why do they get to colonize or take over the word memory? Now I try to attack them, not attack, but engage with in a scholarly fashion, them from their own perspective. And I quote, I'm fond of quoting a paper by Endel Tulving, the great Estonian psychologist, who actually said there are actually 24 distinct kinds of memory, which don't actually work the same way. So their memory, we all know the reference to the Petit Madeleine that starts Proust off on his multi-volume involuntary memory. The way in which you remember taste, just neurologically, the way in which you code taste or smell is very different from how you are able to recall that Barack Obama is President of the United States. And yes, I enjoyed saying that just one last time for the time being, or remembering what's looming around the corner or up the street. Tulving says there are actually 24 distinct types of memory which work neurologically in different ways, such that it might not even be there's anything that links these 24 things together. Well then, in a sarcastic article in a Festschrift for Tolving, his student and protege Roddy Roediger wrote that actually Tolving was wrong. There weren't 24 kinds of memory, there are 256. And I actually agree with that, except that most of the things on there 250, I think it's more like 2,560. In my own work, even though I've focused on this concept of collective memory, I've talked mostly about what I call mnemonic practices, products, and processes. The point of this is not to alliterate PR words, although it helps, but to emphasize multiplicity. Memory is not one thing. Memory is simply an umbrella term we use for a variety of retrospective processes, practices, and products. That is, ways in which, varying ways in which we apprehend the fundamental fact of our existence in time. And these practices include the things that the psychologists discuss, namely recalling your phone number, although none of us really can do that very well anymore because it's all on our phone. And people, of course, who grew up in societies that were innumerate in some way, that didn't grow up with phone numbers and digital mathematical consciousness, don't remember numbers the same way, but psychologists treat the brain as if it were one thing. The point is to emphasize all of the different ways in which human beings come to terms with and make meaning about the past, their existence in time. And the label that I find most compelling for that is memory. I further argue to provoke the psychologists that because what they're talking about is a very narrow list of mnemonic practices and products, when they're talking about memory as mean individual memory, they're the ones who need the adjective individual. And so that we sociologists shouldn't have to talk about collective memory. Because that memory is collective or social should be, at least if sociology has won any territory, should be the starting point for any analysis. So for me, the thing about memory is its existential import as a catch-all for the variety of ways we deal with, confront, represent, and respond to our existence in time. Now, the ways in which we do so, of course, change dramatically across time and place and are always multiple and often contested. So that it might, in fact, be that there's a particular moment in Eastern Europe of, when was the Book of Laughter? I'm forgetting, mid-70s? Something like that. When the comment, which of course was a play on George Orwell, the exact quote, the power of man, the way to fight power is to remember, is basically. Orwell said the same thing in a different context. You've argued that that might not be quite so salient in our post-factual world. It's been salient in different ways at different times and places. One of the things that strikes me about this conference and the notion, this I think was called transregional memory.
Very good,
right?
Very good term.
Right, transregional is a great term, but it also raises the question of what we might mean by regions of memory. And of course, there are many different regions of memory around the world. So that, for instance, we can talk about, I like the term I call memory systems. And I don't really mean anything specific and substantive about memory systems, but the thing that links together many of the countries, the nation states that we've heard about today, is not only their geographic proximity, but that they're facing similar or analogous kinds of issues at a particular moment in history. If we were talking about a different point in time, where there was a different geopolitical constellation, where air travel and communications and the monetary system and international trade were different, then that region might be constituted differently. At the present, there are, of course, a multiplicity, perhaps even infinity, of different regions of memory that constitute memory systems. I would argue that there's a Western European region of memory that's focused largely on the First and Second World War and the integration of Europe. One of the great things about being a memory studies scholar is I get to go to all these places, and I've often pointed out in talks like this that when you arrive in a country you've never visited before to go to a local memory conference, the first thing they do is pull you aside and they say, well, let me tell you, it's totally different here. We have problems in memory like you've never seen. And I'm thinking, they said the same thing in the other place. And so I'm reminded of the Tolstoy line about happy families and unhappy families. I can never quite remember whether it's the happy families or the unfamily, which are different. Happy families are all like, unhappy families are always unique. I actually view it the other way in memory studies. The unhappy memory regions actually have some striking similarities, not only at the national level, but across the region. So that if you compare, for instance, the debates over memory taking place, or that have taken place over the last 20 years, in the Northeast Asian memory region, that is the mnemonic constellation constituted of Japan, South Korea, and China. You see some of the same kinds of processes that you see in Eastern and East Central Europe. You see similar kinds of issues that you see in post-Soviet memory spaces. And it's worth comparing, for instance, and this is a way of pointing out that geography isn't always the most salient feature of region. You compare, for instance, Canada and Australia in terms of issues that they had with dispossessed indigenous children and the like. Another hot spot, hot region, if you will, another memory system is the so-called Southern Cone of Latin America, where the same transitions from dictatorship in the late 1970s and early 1980s, facing similar kinds of human rights violations by particular kinds of regimes, namely bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, created the same kind or same constellation of memory issues, but that are both in some ways powerfully the same and in some ways powerfully different than the kinds of memory debates you get, for instance, in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and these kinds of areas. Now, one thing that was very interesting in the talks today, just checking on the time, one thing that was very interesting about the talks today is that a term that, or a set of terms that has come to characterize memory studies in the last 5 to 10 years was not mentioned very much. And that is the notion of traveling. We heard multi-direction. I think Michael Rothberg was cited once, or entangled memory. Let me just give you a little bit of a brief sketch of the memory rather than history of memory studies. One of the interesting things about memory studies as an institutionalizing scholarly enterprise is that it tells a narrative, it tells a story about itself. It has a memory of itself as an enterprise, which is about as good, which is to say it's terrible, as every other kind of memory. So one of the stories that memory studies tells about itself is that there have been 3 waves of memory studies. The first wave of memory studies is that represented most prominently by Maurice Halbwachs. You've all seen this first footnote at the bottom of every paper that's about memory. Footnote number 1, the term collective memory was coined by French sociologist Maurice Halbwachs in 1925. Cadre socio de la mémoire. Okay. And then not mentioned again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, until Pierre Norat's Lieu de Mémoire, 1984, Paris Galerie. Same footnote 1,000 times. Not true at all. I'll come back to that. The second wave of memory studies is, again, just mentioned, the Norat rediscovery of memory in the 1980s, and as if Halbwachs and Norat, as theorists, had nothing whatsoever to do with each other, even though Halbwachs was there at the beginning of the Annales tradition, and Norat was there, I won't say at the end, but in a much later 3rd generation, at least, and they're organically and intellectually connected, but that somehow between about 1975 and maybe 1989, there was a rediscovery of memory, and Halbwachs, what's interesting, I already mentioned the Koser edition, the 1980 edition of the Collective Memory had an introduction by Mary Douglas, the anthropologist. When it came out in 1980, it was not reviewed even once. There is not a single book review of Halbwachs' Collective Memory from 1980. Not a one. there is a one-paragraph, three-sentence statement in something called Library Journal, and it's signed by somebody named Richard Swedberg, who I know a sociologist named Richard Swedberg, so I wrote to Richard and I said, "Is this you?" And he said, "Oh yeah, they used to give me 20 books a week and I get paid, free book and $15 for writing 3 sentences." But that's the only response to that. The book went out of print. If you want to buy Halbwachs's The Collective Memory in the Ditter's translation with the Douglas introduction, last I checked it was about $400 on a Libris or one of those.
Is it a better translation than the Koser edition?
That's a really interesting story, and
it's a terrible translation.
It's a very problematic translation because it's based on the wrong source. And so the 1980 translation is based on the 1950 French edition, which has a lot of mistakes and a lot of strangenesses. Gérard Namet, a Halbwachs scholar, in fact spent much of his career reconstructing Halbwachs, and in 1988, I believe it is, published a new edition in French. There will be a new edition of The Collective Memory forthcoming from Oxford University Press. I'm editing that, interestingly, with the same translators. What's interesting, it's a fascinating story. I got an email one day from this guy who says, "I'm writing to you about your citations of the 1980 Mary Douglas Halbwachs. I'd appreciate it if you'd give more attention to the translators." Namely, they were my parents. So I went back to the guy, I said, "What's going on here?" Turns out they're alive, that the father was a sociology student in the 1970s at the University of Minnesota, became interested in Durkheim, wanted to write about Halbwachs, got a contract, got Mary Douglas to write an introduction, publish a thing. His dissertation committee didn't want to see him pursue this. The publisher went out of business, and he dropped out of graduate school and became a lawyer, and was practicing attorney for 40 years, actually with complete translations of all 3 of Halbwachs's books about collective memory sitting in his basement, which we're currently working on re-editing and reissuing. So the memory of the first stage of memory studies is false for a couple of reasons. One is that Halbwachs was not the only person using the term collective memory at the time, and so even though he's credited with coining the term and inventing its modern usage, it's not the case. You can play with Google and find lots of earlier uses and other terms. For instance, the term racial memory, which for obvious reasons had died out, was in fact much more common in the first part of the 20th century. And you find it, for instance, in Jung and actually occasionally in Freud as well. Second problem with the Halbwachs interpretation of the first stage is that Halbwachs's interest in memory was not an interest in memory at all. Halbwachs was not he was not writing a book about memory to demonstrate that memory is formed in the present for present purposes. Halbwachs was actually an urban sociologist, and he was interested in the organization of urban space, which is why his second book on memory was the legendary topography of the Gospels in the Holy Land, which was actually a piece of urban studies. The legendary topography appeared only the conclusion in Koser's book. The full translation will be out next year, again, from Oxford. Interestingly, Halbwachs himself never traveled to Jerusalem, so never saw the places that he was writing about. The idea that there was a memory boom in the 1980s, of course, conflates a number of different things that have gone on. Namely that the proliferation of references, public history, interest in the past, the so-called memory industry, the History Channel, popular magazines, documentaries, historical TV shows, and the like. The turn towards the past, the rediscovery of falling down castles and the investment in heritage in Britain and the like, that this popped up out of nowhere, neglects the continuity, is first of all separate from scholarly interest in memory, which was actually steady between the Second World War and Iraq, and it was just often done in other terms. One of the things we find that if memory is a profligate concept that tends to assimilate many different things, we talk now about many things in terms of memory. It used to be we talked about memory in other terms, which is why at the so-called memory boom of the 1980s, a number of critics came out vociferously against the concept. Jeff and I have been doing this since the late One prominent example of this is an article by Noah Getty and Yigal Elam, where they argue that this new concept of memory, wasn't new, but this new concept of memory in the 1980s, most prominently, was acting like molten lava, spreading itself out, filling the crevices, and ultimately breaking up established landscapes. That memory, as a concept, was obliterating the fine distinctions that were established by terms like heritage, or myth, or tradition, or custom, and the like. The question is whether that's true. I'll come back to that. The third wave of memory studies has been about the last 10 years, where the main criticism has been that memory studies has focused too much on the so-called container of the nation state. That it's nation states that propagate memory, that control memory, that generate it, and it's the memory of the nations, the official memory, rather than the vernacular memory, a term we heard in one of the talks today, that's of interest. And so the third wave of memory studies is meant to explode the so-called container of the nation state. The concepts with which it does this are the concepts of traveling memory. So, for instance, the nation state is not the prime container for memory because, for instance, immigrants carry memory from one place to the other. The famous metaphor is the past is a foreign country, which is meant to emphasize our distance from the long-lost past. Noah says we think so much about memory because there's so little of it left. But the past is a foreign country quite literally for people who migrate from one place to another. They carry relics or remnants of their early existence. Later it's photographs, mementos, stories from the old country. Maybe they join a collectivity after an important historical moment. So, for instance, in any discussion about reparations for slavery in the United States, the first reaction from many Americans is, my grandparents came to the United States in 1915, so it's not my problem. We're perfectly happy to go to a 4th of July parade and celebrate the great achievements. There's an old joke about the biggest lie in German history is that Beethoven was German and Hitler was Austrian. Right? Why is it that we're always willing to take on the things, the proud moments, but not willing to take on the shameful moments? There's another feature of memory I want to talk about, namely its propensity for the dark side of the past. So, traveling memory. Memory travels. Memory is multi-directional because the experience gained in a new place is especially true in a multimedia age. Media have become particularly important in a new way to the study of memory because they affect the way that memory travels. All of these different phenomena, the traveling of memory, the multi-directionality of memory, also creates what we call the entanglements of memory. This is a supposedly new revelation, but in fact it actually goes right back to Halbwachs, who talked about our membership in multiple cross-cutting groups. So, this notion of regional memory is not meant to obliterate the distinctions among nation states, or to say that something above the level of the nation state but not yet continental or not global is the most salient variable, or that more local, sub-regional kinds of memory debates, or town memory, or village memory, or family memory, or older sense of the region that is a part of a country, are less important than these others. What it points out is that we're all caught in multiple systems of memory, so that we can be referring, our own memories are structured not simply by the fact that we live in Central or East Central Europe, or in the Caucasus, or that we live in Belarus or Ukraine, or that we live in Berlin, or the Lower East Side of New York, or what have you. We live in many places at many times. We are right now on 16th Street, but we're also in Lower Manhattan, and we're also in New York State, and we're also in the United States, and we're also in the West. This creates multiple references and multiple entanglements. So we're members of many memory systems across regions, which isn't to say that these substantive debates aren't salient at the same time. This is also true, by the way, temporally. That is, our frame of reference temporally is always multiple. That is, you're looking at your watches, I'm looking at my watches, and I'm 40 minutes into a 45-minute lecture. You're thinking about the temporality of the lecture, but you're also thinking it's been a long day, and it's been a long week, and we're at the end of the semester, and the 21st century is young, and how about that Pleistocene era? Right? So we can simultaneously be thinking about the election of Donald Trump to the presidency and the modern era and the century and all of these, and the hour, the week, the month, the year, the decade, the century, the millennium, and geological time. So that we can be referring to events can be shaping our memory that we lived last week, that are in the collective memory from 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Remember 9/11, particularly in this neighborhood. You can also be thinking about modern America and the Civil War, and all of these things are passing through us just as many AM and FM waves pass through our car radios at the same time. These are all part of the entanglements of memory. So the memory of memory studies, which characterizes these three waves of memory, is wrong about each and every one of them. It's wrong about Halbwachs. There was stuff before Halbwachs on collective memory. Halbwachs' notion of memory was part of a different project than we now take it to. The second wave, that there was a memory boom that had nothing to do with that first boom, denies continuities. It also overstates the proliferation of interest in our existence in time, which, as I said, if now we talk about all these different things, tradition, heritage, narrative, custom, and the like, in the terms of memory, it doesn't mean that we're thinking about them new. It just means that we've got a new term for them. And I would also argue that this third wave of memory, actually you demonstrated it yourself. One of the problems of the third wave of memory, and you didn't fall prey to this, is we can throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to make sure that we're not giving too much credit to the nation state. But if everything is traveling and entangled memories, we risk neglecting the power of the nation state to set mnemonic agendas. As I put it in a recent book, states govern memory, they govern with memory, and they're governed by memory. And this is still, I think, it's not the only game in town, but it's an important game in town. Just a couple of words about some of the issues that emerged from and are facing the establishment of the Memory Studies Association. So my argument, in reaction to all these other institutionalized memory or historiological enterprises, that is public history, heritage studies, archival studies, oral history, cultural memory studies, social memory studies, is bring it on. Right? So I called my reader the collective memory reader because I wanted to make a point about the collective nature of memory. We didn't call it the memory studies reader, in part because we wanted to emphasize the sociological point, but also because we only had about 500 pages and about $20,000, and it was going to expand to 6 volumes, right? I should say also I'm editing 6-volume work called The Cultural History of Memory, published by Bloomsbury next year, which is done epochally, but it's too Western-oriented, is one of its problems. One of the issues, so bring it on. And I think that for me, memory studies is an umbrella term, which is not meant like molten lava to filter into the crevices and burst apart old constellations. But it's a provocation. It's a way of making sure that we can look at the relationships and the changes in the relationships among this multiplicity of mnemonic products, practices, and processes. The way in which we remember phone numbers might in fact be related to the organization and memory of the nation state. I don't know what that relationship might be, but something about technology and the assignment. In New York, it's very important to have a 212 area code. Right? So, and why is that important? Because 212 is, in Nola's term, a lieu de mémoire. If I were to move back to New York City,
You were
It would be,
6 for 6.
in fact, when I moved back from Connecticut to New York City, they were offering me something else, and I said, that's terrible, I want a 212. And they said to me, the only 212 exchanges we have left are 666. And most people don't want that. And I said, bring it on. And I was very proud that my phone number was 212-666. I don't remember the rest. So there are lots of potential connections that need to be explored among the wide variety of mnemonic products, practices, and processes. And what memory studies does is it raises that question. What's the relationship between the national trust in Britain and its effort to maintain the so-called cottages as museums and establish a sense of national identity through that, and the kinds of working class narratives that oral historians collect. What I want is a mechanism for bringing those people who work on those things into dialogue with each other. And so memory studies is, in a very gentle, soft way, a colonial enterprise. Jonathan may be cringing in the corner.
This is why you are a czar.
That's right, yes. Now some of the questions that emerge at the meeting is what's the relationship between scholarship and activism, which is a question that's quite potent, and what's the relationship between memory studies and memory practices, which is also a potent question. And so the question I end with is the question that we all face at the beginning, underneath, and at the end of our work is what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Why are we doing what we're doing? And I think that that question remains open for each of us as memory studies scholars. It's not that we have to do one thing or the other. The argument I made against an incursion at the meeting in Amsterdam, which is that it has to be an activist organization or that has to be driven by the practice, the practitioners in the field, the people designing the exhibits, maintaining, doing the artwork, writing the speeches, is that at this particular point in history, I'm especially proud to be a scholar, and I think that scholarship as a unique and special enterprise needs at least a small space to be left for it. And so that's where I hope this organization is going to go. And just a little look at what that might look like. And I would just say that we're organizing the next conference for next year, and that we hope, many of us hope, that many of you will find it a welcome home for the work that you do. Thanks.
I wasn't really joking this morning when I was mentioning or introduced Jeff early on, saying that it's a youngish, or liberal, I didn't say that, but I want to add that, czar of memory studies. And it is a great pleasure to have you with us. And we all are terribly tired, but
Yes.
we are incredibly happy that you were here and that you said what you said. And we are going to ask you questions unless we won't ask you questions, but I think we will ask you questions. So at least we'll make this option possible, if you don't mind. Yes, Mikola Balaban, Ukraine, Lviv, yes.
I have a question. What do you think about politics of memory and institutionalization? Of creation of state institutions that try to set some political agenda to these memory issues, for example, because it's very common for
Institute of Public Memories, for example.
For Central Eastern Europe, I think you know about, especially this post-communist society. And what do you think about that as a scholar of?
I think it's fascinating. We have to study it. We have to, though, I think, keep a certain distance from it. It's another mnemonic product and practice that we, as scholars, look at with a certain kind of distance. How was it done here? How did it used to be done? How is it being done elsewhere? And that does entail, it can take a form of critical theory, should take a form of critical theory, but that I worry particularly about too much collaboration with all the layers that word implies.
Otherwise, you don't want to be implicated, you don't want to be a part of it. You don't think scholarship should become a part of literature.
No, I would say it a little less.
Collaboration.
I don't want to become part
Yeah,
of it.
yeah.
That's the other thing, is that my self-conception as a memory studies scholar, I'm not trying to impose on anyone, and that each of us answers those questions. I'm not averse to memory and power. I'm just not cheap.
Hello. Alisa.
Where do you see the future of memory?
Yes,
Or the
I
near
knew that.
future,
I was
or-
listening to that.
Memory
question.
or memory studies?
Memory studies.
Yeah.
The future of memory studies I see as a
Wrong question, but go ahead.
Or
yeah.
memory.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, that's a good question.
well, so
Like,
let me start.
thinking about it.
Yeah. Do it.
Yeah, I really love the idea of future of memory, but go ahead with.
Well,
memory
I'll
studies.
address both. The future of
Yes.
memory is diverse, changing, dependent on changes in media, dependent on changes in the broadest culture. So, for instance, it's a fascinating topic: the history of memory. Part of it is technological, but part of it is also moral. The way we think about our past in the 20th century was different than the way we think about our collective past in the 19th century. We went from monuments to memorials. That's a pretty big tradition. I've written about what I call the rise of the politics of regret. I find particularly interesting. One of the talks I gave last week was at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and I was talking about the 2000 Stockholm conference, where European leaders got together to confess their guilt for the Holocaust, and that was strange because lots of countries that didn't really have much guilt were rushing to join the parade of guilt, except that in the front row was Yehuda Bauer, who had actually called the conference into existence, and we had an argument about whether disingenuous memory was still worthwhile. And we didn't have an argument because I agree with him that I'll take disingenuous memory over no memory at all. So that's the future of memory is what we study, what we're looking at, what we're observing, what we're watching with a critical distance. The future of memory studies is also dependent on the past of memory studies. One of the formulas I've used again and again is that I think memory studies has left its charismatic stage and is entering its routine phase, which I think is a good thing, right? Institutionalization. So, when I first came to memory studies, again, there was no memory studies, and one of the funny things is I just happened to get there at the right time. And so after I did my first work on Germany, I was like, gee, I really need to theorize this better, so I better think about this memory thing. And I started buying everything and printing out everything I could find that had the word memory in it until I colonized my dining room table. And then I wrote a review essay. And what's really funny is that things that just, I accidentally found, or topics I randomly decided to include in that essay, people now refer back to and say, well, everybody knows that X is part of as a kind of memory, and it's like it just occurred to me one afternoon over a bagel, and it got reified in that article. So what I would like to see is in the routinizing phase of memory studies, more accumulation of knowledge. I actually think we've done a tremendous amount. When I think about what one can go to a memory conference and expect everyone to know now versus 20 years ago is actually remarkable. Not having to explain again that there is this guy named Hallbox and that memory is, not having to give an oral version of the first footnote. That is a tremendous relief. One of the things about the Memory Studies Conference is that, association conference, was that there are certain readings in common that are sort of price of admissions to memory studies, just like any other field. That if you want to be in memory studies, you should at least know who Hallbox was, and if somebody says Lieu de Mémoire, you should have heard of it, and maybe a little less, but Jan Assmann and cultural memory. And that's what I tried to do in the collective memory reader. Some people, it was a fascinating moment when we were originally designing that reader. We had two publishers interested, but because it cost a lot of money to produce, they both sent the proposal out to 8 referees. So we had 16 referees for the collective memory reader, and probably 10 of them thought it should be published.
Yeah.
They thought it should, because it was an effort to establish a canon which was a colonizing imperialistic gesture. And it was nothing of the sort. I mean, I guess every time, well, we're teachers, we write a syllabus at the beginning of every semester. We write comp reading lists for our PhD students. If you want to call yourself a this, that, or the other thing, here's 100 books you should have read. It doesn't mean you shouldn't read a different 100 books. It doesn't mean that every one of those. It's always amazing how much resistance there is to these ideas. So it's not colonial, it's just, I would love to have at least a limited common discourse. That already has happened, particularly in the last 10 years. And so the future of memory studies, I think, is a little bit more common language, a little bit more exchange. We heard papers about loads and loads and loads of different cases, but there was very little talking to each other about the commonalities of the cases, and no comparison of the cases in this particular region of memory with the cases elsewhere. So I'd like to see it be more comparative. We've got an arsenal, not an arsenal, bad term, militaristic. We've got a grab bag of concepts that we can use that are shorthands. We can talk about memo history. We can talk about post-memory, generational memory. We have a sense of what the term trauma means. That common vocabulary is, I think, a necessary feature for not accumulation, not progress in any teleological sense, but advancement in the body of knowledge and insight into the world. That's what I hope for, anyway.
Before Jeff will ask the question, I just wanted to say that the reader that Jeff edited, Memory Studies, it's an extraordinary reader because it actually began the readings in the history of philosophy, in fact, in history of ideas. And since I do have a microphone, not that I'm using it too much, but anyway, because I have a strong voice, I wanted to say that there is a book which came out and it's edited by Dimitri, which actually expands that chapter, and it's an extraordinary book. And those of you who are interested in the question of memory, history of memory, kind of memory thinking in terms of memory, should go to this book.
Yes,
There's a little flyer there. Take a look, and then when we go out for drinks, talk to him about it. Jeff.
And we left an awful lot out of that reader.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean,
But
we
you
just missed
do
some
have,
things.
I mean, amazing stuff. You know, there is Renan, there's this, and it's really kind of taking you in it, in a kind of way of thinking, which it's really year zero was not the complex.
How are we for time?
We are fine. It's up to us. The house is ours. The thing is there, but we started slightly later than we thought. So let me just say that you do have a time for asking questions.
So I'm going to ask, if I ask it here.
And then Dimitri will just collect the questions. So do we, Jeff, Dimitri? Anybody else who wants to have a question afterwards? That's fine too. So there will be possibly 3 questions. Jeff first.
Okay, so
Or comments.
I'm wondering about the advance that we made, and I have kind of 2 concerns about memory. One is that memory is a very deadly business, and I'm wondering if memory studies has tamed that in any way.
I'm sorry, say what you mean by deadly business.
I mean, now not memory studies, but memory.
That we kill over the past.
That we kill over the past. That we remember differently than our neighbor, and we then know that our neighbor is our enemy.
And our parents told us so.
Right, exactly, rather than our neighbor. It's a little variation on the theme I asked to the presentations earlier. So I'm wondering, has memory studies helped us tame the deadliness of the past? And I have my doubts. And then on the other side, I was attracted to memory, as I suggested by the quote from Kundera, and indeed in my reading of Orwell. And I remember very, very vividly having a discussion with Eviatar Zarubova and Barry Schwartz at an ASA meeting, and we were talking about the possibility of putting together a collective memory group. And as is usual in professional activities, I took part in the conversation and then left the forum. But
For Jeff.
and many other people. And you know, I don't really want to say that's a mistake, but I do what I do, and Jeff does what he does. But I remember I explained to Barry why I'm interested in memory, and he was kind of puzzled, but sort of found it interesting. And it is, and it's in the spirit of Kudera that there's a sense in which memory frees us from the present and suggests an alternative future. That you know, I remember what a free Poland was during the communist period, and by remembering what a free Poland was then, I know that the definition of Poland and its future that the authorities are giving us can be criticized, that there are alternatives to it. And again, I wonder, has the advance of memory studies kind of developed that thing? So I don't follow the institutionalization of memory, but this is the reason why I was interested in the interim of your two periods. You know, between Nora,
Between 2 and 3.
between Halbach's and Nora, and I would put Benjamin next to Halbach's.
Many people next to all of us.
Right.
Bob or
But for me,
Yeah.
you know, as I've been thinking through it,
Yeah.
Benjamin has been actually very important, and Arendt is you know, helps me think about Benjamin.
So we'll ask Dimitri to ask another question, to ask the comment question, and then if anybody else, and then we'll ask Jeffrey Olick for the
Yeah, thank you very
response
much
if he has any. Yeah.
for your talk, because thank you very much for your talk. I should say that I've been following your work very fondly since quite some time, so I very appreciate it. And it was, excuse me, one of the inspirations for me to start working on my own project. And so my own presupposition behind that was that with the demise of reason, of the Enlightenment reason with its capital R, I have nothing against reason or reasoning at all, but specifically Enlightenment reason, I think memory takes its place and moves into it. And so in this respect, we are in memory age in a major way. And so I very much want to support what you said, that we are now probably down from the heroic age of memory into this exploration of very multiple possibilities of memories, but I think it will stay with us for quite some time. It just was a brief remark. Thank you. Yeah, and also want to say that it was very interesting for me to listen to what you said, because sometimes this kind of personal account of one's own genealogy, one's own development, how one comes to think about certain topics, really helps to clarify the cohesion of the whole work. So, thank you.
The Tsar has a voice.
So, has memory ever helped us with anything?
No. Now you're asking me that.
No,
No, he's
if I
trying
get the
to
question right, I want to address the
Answer
question.
No.
Or memory studies, thinking about memory,
Has
has
memory studies helped us think about these problems?
I
the advance
yes,
in memory
yes, I
studies.
absolutely
Yeah.
think. I can tell it both personally, and I can also think about it collectively. You talk about the personal narrative. I'm a Jew, and my wife is German. Right? She has grandparents who were Nazis. Right? How do you make sense of that? What do you think about? How do you think about people who've done you wrong, or which side of history you're on? Thinking about, that's why I started thinking about memory. What's the right thing? How do you talk about difficult pasts? What do you say to both your victims and your torturers? These are very dramatic terms. I'm neither victim nor a torturer, nor met any, but how do we...
A very astute observer.
Right, how do we have the conversation? I started out by reading German politicians talking about the German past and being shocked and disgusted with what they had to say. And so that raised the question, well, what did I want them to say, or what did I expect them to say? And that can lead to conversations about, and that, I mean, look, scholarship doesn't filter up, you know, all that often. All right, every now and then somebody in the White House reads John Rawls or something like that. You know, Obama's speechwriters aren't going to
Not in
read.
this way, the
Right.
upcoming one.
But I actually do think that memory studies, scholarly thinking about memory, does shape how we, thinking of the German word, inszenieren, how we stage memory events. And that we as critics, as scholarly critics, when we look at the Bitburg affair, for instance, and talk about how the different interest constellations, when we reflect on whether we think this is an adequate form of memory, or this form of memory is healthy or a good idea at a particular moment, or even when we judge ourselves, when we judge Pierre Nora and ask whether this concept de mémoire is a stimulating concept, or the project of the 7-volume de mémoire encyclopedia is itself a neo-nationalist fantasy, which is one of the accusations that was leveled against him. That kind of discussion, I think, is in fact very helpful. The question of the role of memory, whether it replaces reason or not, is in fact one of the most important questions for memory scholars to ask. What is the role of memory now, and what, you know, does the rise of vernacular memory or public history today represent the loss of faith in utopian visions or political projects? Is it retrogressive? That's a central question for memory studies. Are we living in a retrospective, a retrogressive age? And is Svetlana Boym's work on the future of nostalgia, I think, is a classic example where she identifies two distinct kinds of nostalgia: reflective nostalgia, restorative nostalgia. She finds reflective nostalgia, insofar as it helps you think about how far we've come, can be a positive force, but restorative nostalgia, of which Donald Trump is a Make America Great Again, is a classic negative example. Thinking through those things philosophically, social scientifically, conceptually, I think is an enormous help. At least it's been a help to me in thinking about the world.
Well, at the first place, I want to thank you, and I think we all
Pleasure.
are incredibly thankful to you for talking to us.